array, for the purpose of advancing to take possession of the city. Although it was September, and the weather had been cold and stormy, it happened that on that morning the sun came out bright, and the air was calm, giving promise of a warm day. And as the movement into the city was to be a peaceful one, a procession as it were, and not a hostile march, the men were ordered to leave their coats of mail and all their heavy armour in camp, that they might march the more unencumbered. While they were advancing in this unconcerned and almost defenceless condition, they saw before them, on the road leading to the city, a great cloud of dust arising. It was a strong body of King Harold's troops coming out to attack them. At first Tostig and the Norwegians were completely lost and bewildered at the appearance of so unexpected a spectacle. Very soon they could see weapons glittering here and there, and banners flying. A cry of the enemy arose, and passed along their ranks, producing universal alarm. Tostig and the Norwegian Harold halted their men, and marshalled them hastily in battle array. The English Harold did the same, when he had drawn up near to the front of the enemy. Both parties then paused, and stood surveying one another. Presently there was seen advancing from the English side a squadron of 20 horsemen, splendidly armed and bearing a flag of truce. They approached to within a short distance of the Norwegian lines, when a herald, who was among them, called aloud for Tostig. Tostig came forward in answer to the summons. The herald then proclaimed to Tostig that his brother did not wish to contend with him, but desired, on the contrary, that they should live together in harmony. He offered him peace, therefore, if he would lay down his arms, and he promised to restore him his former possessions and honours. Tostig seemed very much inclined to receive this proposition favourably. He paused and hesitated. At length he asked the messenger what terms King Harold would make with his friend and ally, the Norwegian Harold. "He shall have," replied the messenger, 7 feet of English ground for a grave. He shall have little more than that, for he is taller than common men. "Then," replied Tostig, "tell my brother to prepare for battle. It shall never be said that I abandoned and betrayed my ally and friend." The troop returned with Tostig's answer to Harold's lines, and the battle almost immediately began. Of course the most eager and inveterate hostility of the English army would be directed against the Norwegians and their king, whom they considered as foreign intruders, without any excuse or pretext for their aggression. It accordingly happened that, very soon after the commencement of their conflict, Harold the Norwegian fell, mortally wounded by an arrow in his throat. The English king then made new proposals to Tostig to cease the combat, and come to some terms of accommodation. But in the meantime Tostig had become himself incensed, and would listen to no overtures of peace. He continued the combat until he was himself killed. The remaining combatants in his army had now no longer any motive for resistance. Harold offered them a free passage to their ships, that they might return home in peace if they would lay down their arms. They accepted the offer, retired on board their ships, and set sail. Harold then, having in the meantime heard of William's landing on the southern coast, set out on his return to the southward, to meet the more formidable enemy that menaced him there. His army, though victorious, was weakened by the fatigues of the march, and by the losses suffered in the battle. Harold himself had been wounded, though not so severely as to prevent his continuing to exercise the command. He pressed on toward the south with great energy, sending messages on every side into the surrounding country, on his line of march, calling upon the chieftains to arm themselves and their followers, and to come on with all possible dispatch and join him. He hoped to advance so rapidly to the southern coast as to surprise William before he should fully entrenched himself in his camp, and without his being aware of his enemy's approach. But William, in order to guard effectually against surprise, had sent out small reconnoitring parties of horsemen on all the roads leading northward, that they might bring him in intelligence of the first approach of the enemy. Harold's advance guard met these parties, and saw them as they drove rapidly back to the camp to give the alarm. Thus the hope of surprising William was disappointed. Harold found, too, by his spies, as he drew near, to his utter dismay, that William's forces were 4 times as numerous as his own. It would, of course, be madness for him to think of attacking an enemy in his entrenchments with such an inferior force. The only alternative left him was either to retreat, or else to take some strong position and fortify himself there, in the hope of being able to resist the invaders and arrest their advance, though he was not strong enough to attack them. Some of his counsellors advised him not to hazard a battle at all, but to fall back toward London, carrying with him or destroying everything which could afford sustenance to William's army from the whole breadth of the land. This would soon, they said, reduce William's army to great distress for want of food, since it would be impossible for him to transport supplies across the Channel for so vast a multitude. Besides, they said, this plan would compel William, in the extremity to which he would be reduced, to make so many predatory excursions among the more distant villages and towns as would exasperate the inhabitants, and induce them to join Harold's army in great numbers to repel the invasion. Harold listened to these counsels, but said, after consideration, that he could never adopt such a plan. He could not be so derelict to his duty as to lay waste a country which he was under obligations to protect and save, or compel his people to come to his aid by exposing them, designedly, to the excesses and cruelties of so ferocious an enemy. Harold determined, therefore, on giving William battle. It was not necessary, however, for him to attack the invader. He perceived at once that if he should take a strong position and fortify himself in it, William must necessarily attack him, since a foreign army, just landed in the country, could not long remain inactive on the shore. Harold accordingly chose a position 6 or 7 miles from William's camp, and fortified himself strongly there. Of course, neither army was in sight of the other, or knew the numbers, disposition, or plans of the enemy. The country between them was, so far as the inhabitants were concerned, a scene of consternation and terror. No one knew at what point the 2 vast clouds of danger and destruction which were hovering near them would meet, or over what regions the terrible storm which was to burst forth when the hour of that meeting should come would sweep in its destructive fury. The inhabitants, therefore, were everywhere flying in dismay, conveying away the aged and the helpless by any means which came most readily to hand, taking with them, too, such treasures as they could carry, and hiding in rude and uncertain places of concealment those which they were compelled to leave behind. The region thus, which lay between the 2 encampments, was rapidly becoming a solitude and a desolation, across which no communication was made, and no tidings passed to give the armies at the encampments intelligence of each other. Harold had 2 brothers among the officers of his army, Gurth and Leofwin. Their conduct toward the king seems to have been of a more fraternal character than that of Tostig, who had acted the part of a rebel and an enemy. Gurth and Leofwin, on the contrary, adhered to his cause, and as the hour of danger and the great crisis which was to decide their fate drew nigh, they kept close to his side, and evinced a truly fraternal solicitude for his safety. It was they specially who had recommended to Harold to fall back on London, and not to risk his life and the fate of his kingdom on the uncertain event of a battle. As soon as Harold had completed his encampment, he expressed a desire to Gurth to ride across the intermediate country and take a view of William's lines. Such an undertaking was less dangerous than it would have been at the present day, for now such a reconnoitring party would be discovered from the enemy's encampment at a great distance by means of spy-glasses, and a 24-pound shot or Rochelle would be sent from a battery to blow the party to pieces or drive them away. The only danger then was of being pursued by a detachment of horsemen from the camp, or surrounded by an ambuscade. To guard against these dangers, Harold and Gurth took the most powerful and fleetest horses in the camp,